Thank you very much to come on this beautiful day to listen to Christine Legare, who is coming to talk about the evolution and ontogeny of ritual. She is an associate professor at the University of Texas, Austin, and her research specializes in human culture and how we can create, transmit, learn all sorts of cultural things. And this is in the context of a project funded by the John Templeton Foundation that Johan and I are leading on evolutionary ethics and human origins. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm very excited to share a lot of the insights that we've gleaned from a research project that actually started in part at the University of Oxford. So this line of research came out of an ESRC-funded project in collaboration with Harvey Whitehouse and a number of others in the Department of Anthropology. And most of the research that I'm going to talk about today is the product of that research program that's gone on in lots of different unexpected directions. And this program of research is comparative in pretty much all possible ways. So that we do comparisons across species, across cultures, and my training is in developmental science. We do a lot of comparisons across age. So rituals, as many of you probably would expect, are universal features of human culture. Now, the diversity of ritual practices is truly astonishing and ranges from things like just simple greetings to initiation rites to very elaborate religious ceremonies. When you hear the word ritual, people often associate it with religion, and of course religion is absolutely full of ritual, but so are really all aspects of any human social organization, including academia. So I gave a talk recently at an interdisciplinary gathering, and a very well-respected economist announced that he personally engaged in no rituals himself, and I pointed out to him that we were in fact engaging in a ritual as we spoke. So rituals are unavoidable. They're so common in human cultures that we often don't even notice them. And going to another population or another cultural group is a great way to experience how critical and core rituals are to all aspects of human functioning. Because when you go to a new population, you often don't know all the ritual practices and realize the sooner you learn those practices, the better you will operate within that particular population. So in my program of research, I seek to understand how rituals evolved from a phylogenetic perspective, to understand the adaptive functions of ritual, like what are they for, why are they useful, and also to examine how they develop over the course of ontogeny. So a big part of what children are attempting to do is to become members of the particular social groups that they're part of. And if you want to be an effective member of a social group, you have to know the ritual practices of that group. So a big part of what children are trying to figure out is what are the ritual practices of their population. And I'll go into some detail on how children are capable of doing that. So rituals serve very powerful functions in human groups, and I think they should be a focal topic of interdisciplinary social scientific inquiry. I think increasingly they are becoming really core to understanding social group functioning. So I want you to consider an example of a ritual. This ritual here is a Brazilian simpatia. So simpatias are remedial recipes. They're ritualistic procedures. And there are simpatias for every problem you can imagine having. So they're used very widely in Brazil to treat problems ranging from asthma to infidelity to bad luck to unemployment. Whatever problem you have, there is a sympatia for you. Now, sympatia is really fascinating to study because they're not associated with a particular religious group per se. So it gave us a lot of scientific freedom in how we study these. It's much easier to come up with a ritualistic remedy or to generate one than to generate a new prayer, for example. People might question the the validity of a practice of that sort. So this particular sympatia is to attract a partner. So you buy a new sharp knife and stick it 4 times into a banana tree on June 12th at midnight. You catch the liquid that will drip from the plant's wound on a crisp white paper, not just any paper, has to be crisp and white, that's been folded in 2. And the dripping liquid captured on the paper will form the letter of the name of your future partner. Okay, so if you can't figure out why people think these might work, you're not alone. If you ask people who use these are widely used, by the way, how it works, they also can't explain it. So this is one of the great puzzles of fascinations, really, of anthropology. So ethnographers have asked people about the ritual practices of their population for many, many, many decades at this point. And people will often comment on the fact that they don't know why you have to do with this particular ritual in this particular way. They just have a sense that this is how we do it. And you ask them why, they're like, well, this is just how we do it. That really suffices for an explanation. I find this fascinating because one of my areas of expertise is causal reasoning. And we know that even from really early childhood, young children have very sophisticated cause and effect reasoning abilities. So I think it's fascinating that a lot of the activities that we engage in really have no underlying physical causal mechanism and really aren't about physical causality anyway. So I'll give you some, I won't do too much of a spoiler alert. I'll give you the information about how the kind of human psychological system processes this kind of information later. But all those procedural details aren't a coincidence. And the fact that the rituals are widely used for fitness-relevant events like mating, birth, death, marriage, not an accident that those really critical life courses are heavily ritualized. So, I mean, here's an example of using a ritual for an instrumental goal, right? Very clear, I am doing this ritual to attract a partner. And I mean, not me personally, but there is an instrumental goal here. Now, rituals also have social goals, right? So not all the rituals that we engage in have a concrete, specific instrumental goal. If you consider the very rich ethnographic literature on rituals, this is from some really excellent ethnography by Roy Rappaport. He studied the Zimbaga of New Guinea. And the Zimbaga ritual cycle centers around periodic warfare between competing groups. And these groups, they compete over resources, as human groups do, and will often retaliate over transgressions committed between the groups. Now, the timing of their warfare is closely related to the size and the spread of pig herds. So pigs are a really important food source, really valuable within that population. And there are complex ritualistic practices surrounding warfare, and there are a number of rituals that take place prior to battle in order to announce to gods that battle will occur and attempt to procure some protection. So when I read ethnographic accounts, and these are incredibly detailed, there's a tremendous amount of information about what predicts when a battle will occur and how this is correlated with the size of the herd and all kinds of detail of this sort. There's an enormous amount of detail about particular ritual practices. And when I read this, I'm kind of struck by just the amount of ethnographic richness there. And good ethnography is tremendously psychologically insightful. I try to evangelize to my friends who are psychologists who don't spend enough time reading literature and other disciplines. But another thing that really strikes me when I read this kind of ethnography is that these ritual practices are very costly in terms of time, in terms of effort. People are putting a lot of time and energy into engaging in these practices. So these collective rituals are, in fact, so adaptive and useful that they offset all of the costs and resources that go into their practices. So it's just worth considering, because I have colleagues who, when they read examples of these sympathias and they just think, why would anybody think this would work? Like, there's no way people think these actually work. My response to that is, people are putting time and effort into engaging in them. So why spend money, why spend resources, why spend time when you don't, at least in principle, think these sorts of things might work? So let's step back. I've used the word ritual many times at this point in the lecture. What is ritual? There have been many who have spent their careers defining this. Keep in mind that I deeply a comparative scientist, so my definition of ritual lends itself to comparison across disciplines. And my background is in cognitive science. So the definition that I have that I'm using is based in a kind of cognitive psychological account of what rituals are. There's two critical defining features of ritual in from my perspective. Right? This doesn't capture every detail of what ritual is, but these are really core features. Rituals are socially stipulated group conventions. So basically, rituals are a social contract. They're an agreement to engage in a socially determined convention or norm. And thus, very critically, they're not the product of individual innovation. So sometimes people will say to me, oh, I have my own rituals. I do this, and I brush my teeth, and then I have breakfast. How many of you do that, by the way? Brush your teeth before you eat breakfast versus after. Who are the before breakfast brushers? And who are the after? Okay, right. This is evidence that these are not rituals, right? So these are habits. They look like ritual, they smell a bit like ritual, but they're not ritual because they're not socially stipulated. So personal habits pull from the cultural milieu that you operate in. We operate in contexts where people have breakfast and they brush their teeth. So the practices they use pull from the larger cultural behavioral repertoire, but there's not the kind of standardization that you find in ritual practices. Rituals are also almost without exception causally opaque. So even when rituals are explained in the context of achieving a certain outcome or having a particular goal, so for example, engaging in synchronous dancing with the objective of this causing some increase in rainfall, even when rituals have particular goals, there's not the expectation or the requirement that the process by which the ritual practice will achieve its goal is via a transparent or knowable causal mechanism. So in that sympathia, if you could find some kind of physical causal mechanism for how that might work, we should talk later. There's a career in in sympathias for you. But the point is, we just simply don't need to have a physical causal mechanism. This actually turns out to be tremendously useful from a cultural transmission perspective. So I'll talk about why I think that was selected. Rituals are not errors in our cognitive system. They are, in fact, they have been shaped by cognitive and cultural evolution to do really important things that I will talk about today. So rituals serve social functions in human groups. They do lots of useful things in terms of identity and cohesion, and I'll talk about that. They drive cultural transmission intergenerationally. So take the example of Catholic Mass. Right? I can go to a Catholic Mass in any country in the world, in any number of languages that I do not speak, and I will still, with great accuracy, know roughly what's happening. I'll know when to kneel, I'll know when to sit, I'll know when to cross myself. All of these sorts of practices are transmitted with such extraordinary fidelity that even if I don't know the language, I still know how to participate. That is tremendously, tremendously powerful. Rituals provide insight into the evolution and ontogeny of group cognition and behavior. As a psychologist, this is kind of focally what I'm interested in understanding. And as I mentioned, they are products of cognitive and cultural evolution in humans, and I'll give you lots of examples of that throughout my talk. So the big picture objective of my research program, my trainings in cognitive and evolutionary anthropology, cognitive science, but also in evolutionary biology, is to develop a kind of integrative big picture account of ritual cognition and behavior. And I'm interested in understanding ritual from the perspective of Tinbergen's 4 questions. So I'll begin by discussing kind of big ultimate questions of the phylogeny of ritual. And I'll also discuss some of my theoretical and empirical work on the adaptive value of ritual. And I'll end the talk by discussing kind of more proximate questions of the kind of underlying physical, kind of psychological mechanisms of how ritual is processed by the mind, and then also how we acquire the rituals of our communities of origin. So let's start with the phylogeny of ritual. Now, beliefs that associate cause and effect where none actually exist in a kind of physical way has really ancient evolutionary roots. So we're not the only species that does this. So consider a captive chimp colony located near an airport. So it's a group of chimps who are all located near a busy airport. For example, Heathrow. So imagine there's a group of chimps that just happen to live near Heathrow. And it turns out one day they experience a big, giant mechanical bird, otherwise known as an airplane, flying overhead. And the alpha male chimp comes out and starts to do lots of display and posturing and is afraid of this and wants to scare this big mechanical bird away. And so he does all these aggressive displays, and sure enough, the plane continues, mechanical bird plane, continues to fly. And every day, there's another mechanical bird that comes out, and he does this display, and that mechanical bird is scared away. It works every single time, right? So this chimp, as you can imagine, might make a false association between his physical prowess and aggression and this mechanical bird's departure. So in the mind of the chimp, there is an association between his behavior and a particular outcome. Now, overestimating the association between cause and effect is adaptive. It leads to errors sometimes, for sure, but it's adaptive. So evolution should favor mechanisms that identify noise as a potential signal or a threat, even when the chance of the threat is remote. So it's better to err on the side of identifying rustling leaves as a tiger. You're going to make a lot of errors that way. But it's better to err on the side of guessing there's a tiger and there not being a tiger than not guessing there's a tiger and there is a tiger, turns out. So the point is that natural selection can favor strategies that lead to frequent errors in association as long as the occasional correct response carries a large fitness benefit, right? So that's one part of where ritual might come from. I think it's a really fascinating set of questions surrounding whether other animals have ritual. It's a topic that I'm very interested in. And there have been some claims, for example, among evolutionary anthropologists that chimps might engage in kind of ritualistic rock throwing and other behaviors that kind of resemble rituals. Now, I think it's very important to not to over-attribute human-like thinking onto other animals. And there's lots of reasons that chimps might throw rocks in particular sorts of ways. They might be engaging in display behaviors. It's hard to have a conversation with a chimp to ask them about why they're engaging in the behaviors that they're engaging in. But the general principle that at least some aspects of ritual, or the kind of the psychological, behavioral repertoire that leads to ritual are shared with other animals seems pretty probable to me. But there isn't a lot of evidence that other animals engage in the kinds of ritualistic activities of humans, at least not of the kind of structural complexity and diversity that we see in humans. So erring on the side of caution is a survival strategy, as I mentioned, even if it leads to sometimes seemingly bizarre behaviors. And some rituals, especially the rituals of other populations, I've noticed, can seem pretty bizarre. So rituals might be, and I think this is very plausible, a byproduct of our hazard precaution system, oriented towards detecting and reacting to inferred threats to fitness. So dangers in our evolutionary past and current and present, in fact, reproductive risk, predation, contamination, resource scarcity, social harm, all of those things are associated with ritualistic behavior. So rituals are, in part, this is not the only thing they are, it's part of what they are a behavioral response to reduce uncertainty, an attempt to avoid negative outcomes. For example, loss in battle. So the Zimbaga, which I mentioned, a big part of their rituals are to basically increase the chances of a good outcome happening and decrease the chances of a bad outcome happening. And in the case of the Zimbachias, those are very much about trying to get good things to happen and prevent bad things from happening. If you look in the ethnographic literature, as I often do, lots of evidence for this, very classic anthropological work by Malinowski. One of the things he documented among the Trobriand Island fishermen is this relationship between ritual and uncertainty. So when he documented is that rituals were very common when the weather conditions were quite dangerous, when the seas were very rocky. And during these very dangerous open sea expeditions, far less ritualistic practices in the safer and calmer lagoons. So there does seem to be this recurring evidence for an association between ritual and uncertainty. So let's talk a little bit about the adaptive value or function of ritual. So we are a social group living primate species, and we live in large groups. In modern environments, we live in extremely kind of unprecedented populations in terms of size. And living in large groups is associated with a number of different adaptive problems. So you have to coordinate groups or members of your group for collective action. For any of you working in academia who've attempted to organize your colleagues to achieve shared goals, you resonate that this is not always an easy thing to do. You need to minimize free riders. This will also be familiar to you. So how do you catalyze and incentivize and motivate your colleagues to do their fair share of the work? Not always an easy thing to do. You need to increase group commitment to joint goals. So how do you get all of your group members to work together toward achieving common goals? You also need to prevent defection to rival groups, right? You need to retain your colleagues and your coalition and prevent them from defecting to rival groups. So one possibility is that ritual is a solution to problems of group living. And let me explain how it solves basically all of these problems or addresses it. As I've mentioned, rituals have social functions. Rituals, as you can see, are associated with religion. Religions is a great example of a system of belief and behavior and organization associated with particular groups, but rituals pervade all kinds of non-religious activities as well. In fact, all human activities. So one of the social functions of ritual is to provide reliable markers of group membership. So rituals mark members of a group in practically and psychologically powerful ways, and they serve as an indication of a group's kind of behavioral type. They facilitate, in that way, cooperative and affiliative interactions. So it's not an accident that ritual behavior, and even things like ritual dress, the sorts of detailed bits of information that you would only have if you were a member of a group, demarcate you as a member of a group, but also, on the flip side of that, demarcate you as someone who's not a member of another group. So a lot of the symbolic gestures that people engage in, physical markers, lots of examples of this in organized religion, signal to others that you were a member of a particular group. One of the things that I always think of is an example of some family friends of mine who converted to Catholicism kind of later on in their life. and they knew all of the particular practices of Catholicism far better than members of my family, kind of ethnically, culturally Catholic. But they were deeply committed to signaling to others that they were legitimate. Yeah. So another social function of rituals is that they often include sometimes costly activities that signal to others, it could serve as reliable signals to others of an individual commitment to the group. So they provide salient evidence of behavioral commitment. This would be, this rod piercing this man's cheeks is one maybe especially costly example. But keep in mind, when I say cost, I in some cases would refer to things like physical pain that people are willing to tolerate to signal to others that they are so committed to the group that they're willing to bear this. But cost can mean time, it can mean resources. You know, attending this religious ceremony every week when you could do other things is costly from some perspective. Rituals also facilitate cooperation. So there's growing evidence that just engaging in rituals together increases cooperation. It basically gives you a shared behavioral repertoire. When you have a shared of ritualistic practices, a set of prayers in some cases, a set of ceremonies to engage in, this creates cooperation. Rituals are incredibly good at this. Richard Sosis, an evolutionary anthropologist, did a really fascinating study demonstrating that, it was a study done in Israel, that religious men living in a kibbutz were more cooperative than secular men living in the same kibbutz. So there is some evidence that participation and commitment to ritual in the context of religion and otherwise increases cooperation. They're also very useful. Rituals are useful to groups that perform them because they function as mechanisms of social cohesion, which is related to the cooperation, and foster the longevity of groups. Harvey Whitehouse, who is based here, has done lots of interesting research on ritual, the effect of ritual on fusion, on group fusion. So engaging in ritualistic practices fuses you to groups, and there's lots of very powerful examples of this. Next, I want to talk a bit about the kind of psychological machinery of ritual. I've done quite a bit of research on this. So let's go back to the sympatia example. The use of rituals for protective or problem-solving purposes is pervasive across populations. One of the things that I discovered when I attended a religious studies conference a few years ago, I just begun to study these Brazilian simpatias, and I went to a presentation by an Egyptologist. Is that what experts in ancient Egypt are called? Anyway, so I went to his talk, and one of the things he did was describe these ancient Egyptian ritualistic remedies. And on a superficial level, the content of the particular practices was different, but they looked remarkably similar to the kind of simpatias people do in modern-day Brazil. And these are from like 1500 BC. It's extraordinarily similar. So there's a lot of historical continuity in using rituals for protective or problem-solving purposes. They're often associated with particular goals. They might be causally opaque, but rituals are often done for particular reasons. And keep in mind, humans are expert intention readers. So when we observe someone engaging in a very detailed, very intentional, goal-directed sequence of actions, we infer, well, there's a reason this person does it that way. Even if I don't know all the details, this person clearly intended to do this in this particular way, and I will do the same. So it's a big part of how rituals are transmitted. And as I said, not having a physical causal explanation for how rituals work is not a deterrent. You don't need to have that information, and in fact, it's fine if it's entirely unknowable anyway. That doesn't deter us. Again, these are socially transmitted procedures. So you can go to a website and download a sympatia for any problem you might have, but you can't create your own sympatia unless you're me and do it to do experimental research. But of course, you don't tell your participants that, or they wouldn't consider them to be credible. So this leads me to what I think of as the ritual paradox. So rituals are widely used to treat problems. Thus, we assume they can have causal efficacy, right? Engaging in that particular, using that particular sympatia assumes that this might have a causal effect. Yet we completely lack a mechanism for how that might work. So how do people evaluate the efficacy of ritual in the absence of any causal information? Right? Lots of the sympatias are oriented towards love problems, as it turns out, and are often used by people on behalf of others. So I've studied what I think of as the universal kind of psychological grammar of ritual using experimental methodologies. So I integrate and apply cognitive anthropological and cognitive psychological approaches to the study of ritual cognition. So rather than evaluate the actual efficacy of a ritualistic practice, which is very, very difficult to do, what I do is look at the kinds of information that influence how people perceive ritual efficacy. Ultimately, that's what's important. It's your perception of whether rituals are effective or not that matters. Because I do want to point out that it's very, very, very difficult to disprove these. So one of my collaborators on this line of research, my primary collaborator, Andre Sousa, is Brazilian. And he was the one who introduced me to what sympatias are. And he mentioned that his mother was an active practitioner of sympatias. And one of the things that she made him do as a child is sleep with a dictionary under his bed. Assuming this knowledge is going to filter into the brain through some kind of osmosis. And so, you know, obviously years go by, he gets his PhD at a major university in the US and becomes successful as a scientist. And he went back to Brazil and he was teasing his mother about this and said, "Oh, Ma, remember you made me sleep with that ridiculous dictionary under my bed, and I went on to study, sympatias and all the rest of that." And she said, "You know what, you're welcome." It's like, what? Did you not get your PhD? Are you not a doctor now? Complete lack of gratitude. So the point is, it is tremendously hard to demonstrate that these things do not work. So let's go back to this Brazilian sympatia. I want to point out a few things and a few details here. Look at the procedural detail. The kind of procedure is specified, the date is specified, there's repetition, lots of detail of that sort. There's particular artifacts involved. They're often religious icons. So how do we demonstrate that this kind of information might impact how people think these rituals might work? And keep in mind, if you ask people how sympatias work, they have no idea. They don't mention any of this. These are all of this is intuitive. Well, here's how we studied this experimentally. So we generated sympatias based on the content of actual sympatias. So there's lots of details there. In this case, there's fewer number of steps. In this case, there's far more procedural steps. We gave different versions of this to different people, matched it with a particular problem that it's meant to solve, and asked how effective do you think these sympatias will be at treating these particular problems. Well, it turns out that the perception of ritual efficacy is a product of intuitive causal reasoning. So information about repetition, number of procedural steps, time specificity, the presence of that information increases how effective people think these ritualistic remedies are. Also, if there's a religious icon, if there's an icon of Virgin Mary, even if it's not clear what that icon is doing, just the presence of that increases the perception of ritual efficacy. We've also found that if you prime uncertainty, that increases how effective people think these practices are. So on that note, in recent years, I have begun kind of integrating my research with ritual with applied global public health. Now this is a ritual that's very widespread in northern India. This occurs on the 6th day after birth. This is an initiation ceremony. Note, date is specified. Not just any time, between 10 and 12 p.m. It needs to be brand new clothes that the infant wears. A lamp needs to be lit. The lamp has to be soaked in ghee in particular. There are religious icons involved, right? So on some level, the superficial details are a little different. Doesn't this look like a sympatia to you in many ways, right? So there's repetition, there's procedural detail, right? Rituals are the product of the human mind. And all of this sort of detail is relevant. And you ask people, do you need to engage in every single bit of this? They say, of course. Right? If I omit something, this might not work. Right? Any mechanism here? Any physical causal mechanism? I think not. One of the things that I'm working on now, given how pervasive rituals are, the kind of powerful social functions that they have, their association with fitness-relevant events, one of the things that I'm working on is determining whether a better understanding of ritual will improve particular sorts of health and educationally related outcomes. And I want to describe how we're doing that. So we're focusing in particular on early childhood. So, in fact, very early, the period of pregnancy, birth, and the period right after birth. So we're working in Bihar, India in particular, well, for a number of reasons. One is that infant mortality in Bihar is 10 times higher than it is in the UK. About 48 per 1,000 births in Bihar, it's about 4 in the UK. And so in a context where the threat of losing your newborn baby is high, one of the things that we have found, and that I and others would predict, is that the greater the risk and the more serious the risk, and I can't imagine any risk greater than losing a baby, the greater the ritualization is surrounding pregnancy. And it turns out in Bihar, ritual, or the period of pregnancy, birth, and the period after birth are hyper-ritualized. There are intensive number of ritualistic practices surrounding these periods. Now, Western biomedicine is effectively another set of ritualistic practices that populations need to adopt. So one of the things we're attempting to do is figure out how does a better understanding of the rituals that currently exist allow us to think through more effective ways to introduce new rituals under the assumption that these new rituals are useful. So just want to give you very quickly a few examples of some of the rituals associated with pregnancy, childbirth, and the newborn period. A lot of these are about protection. They're about avoiding contamination and purity, all about reducing risk, physical risk as well as supernatural risk. As I mentioned previously, rituals mark key points in an individual's life course. They're transmitted across generations. So if you think about, for those of you who have given birth, you might notice that there are many ritualistic practices that you didn't realize that your population of origin practices until you were engaging in birth yourself. Very quickly learned from others in your community that these were in fact mandatory things you were supposed to do, that you were unable to opt out of. And people who you don't even know offer advice about all these sorts of things and then judge you if you don't engage in them. But anyway, I digress. So rituals are heavily reinforced through social norms. And the more protective a population thinks the practices are, the less you have an option to opt out. So if you go to a hospital or you go to see a pediatrician, an obstetrician in the UK, they'll give you a whole set of practices that you need to engage in. You have to go to appointments at this regularity, this many times. These practices have to occur. 99.9% of us have no idea why we have to do these things. But we don't dare deviate, right? Ask yourself why that might be. So one of the things we're investigating is the potential to create new rituals. Rituals are created all the time, after all. To reframe rituals, the meaning associated with rituals, and to, in some cases where necessary, alter existing rituals. And I'll give you a concrete example of how we're doing that. So one of the things that we are investigating is promoting exclusive early onset breastfeeding in these populations. So as you can imagine, not engaging in exclusive breastfeeding early on in pregnancy can be associated with a lot of different risks, especially if you're living in a population where water is not sanitary. So feeding a newborn baby contaminated water is a major risk for increasing disease and mortality. So there's a huge amount of effort put into exclusive breastfeeding from birth. Well, breast milk, the first breast milk that's expressed is colostrum. Turns out colostrum taboos are very widespread around the world, including in India. And colostrum, for those of you who don't know, looks kind of different than milk. It looks a bit like mucus. It has that texture. So there's a lot of taboos associated with that, and it's very common in this population to express the colostrum and discard it. In fact, we know colostrum has a whole bunch of different health benefits for the immune system of the baby. So a big part of what we're attempting to do is reframe the meaning of colostrum as liquid gold instead of something that's a contaminant. And incorporating the feeding of colostrum and exclusive feeding into other rituals that currently exist within the population. So, last but not least, especially given that this is very core to my area of expertise, my core expertise, how do children acquire ritualistic practices of their communities? Well, we know children use imitation to learn rituals, to learn basically all different sorts of practices. And a big part of the motivation to imitate is to affiliate with others. So those of you who have young children or know young children might have noticed that they imitate much of your behavior. And you often learn about behavior you engage in, you didn't even realize you engage in, by watching your child imitate you and every gesture that you engage in. So a big part of how we acquire ritual is through imitation. Well, it turns out that studying imitation in the context of ritual provides a lot of insight into when children imitate the behavior of others, when they engage in more behavioral variation or innovation, and to what degree. So when children determine that a behavior is a ritual, they engage in much higher imitative fidelity. They imitate much more precisely than when they assume this is a more instrumental behavior. And this is really critical because innovation stays low, individual innovation that is, no matter how many times the child is engaged in a ritualistic practice. So if you think about this in the context of adulthood, no matter how many times you've engaged or attended a particular religious ceremony, there's never appropriate time to engage in your own individual innovation. I learned that the hard way as a child. Like, really, do we have to kneel at this time every single Mass? Yes, it turns out you do. And even young children understand that. How do children determine when something is a ritual? Turns out conventional language. So if you say to a child or an adult, this is how we always do things, they imitate it with much higher fidelity than if you say, this is my way of doing it. Right? So cues to conventionality. If children watch multiple people engage in a behavior, they imitate that behavior much more carefully than if only one person engaged in the behavior. If we have multiple people engaging in the same behavior at the same time and in synchrony, you get the highest imitative fidelity of all. You might notice, for example, in a lot of collective rituals, in the context of religion or otherwise, all of these things are features of ritual. Collective language, many people engaging in the same behavior at the same time. Turns out even 3-year-olds are attentive to all of this information. So from an extremely young age, as early as we've been able to study, young children are attentive to cues to ritual. So I've mentioned that ritual is associated with high levels of imitative fidelity. It's associated with low levels of innovation, which is why you get religious ceremonies being transmitted around the world over the course of thousands of years. Their difference detection is much more accurate in the context of ritual. And it's not just that children imitate or transmit ritual with high levels of fidelity when they're in the context of peer groups and with parents. Rituals are also associated with high fidelity transmission. Rituals are also associated with functional fixedness, which is why take a religious chalice, for example. It's never appropriate to use that to drink Coca-Cola, even though it has the affordance of a cup, right? A rosary could fit around your neck, but that's not where you're supposed to put it. Also found that out from my grandmother. It's not just the case that this difference or this kind of differentiation between ritual and other kinds of behavior it's not just a product of Western populations. You find this all over the world. So it's a picture of a little girl in Vanuatu and in Austin, Texas. If you frame a behavior as a ritual, children imitate it with much higher levels of fidelity. And all it takes is, this is how we do it. And by the way, you could even get them to do silly, causally opaque things like tap the bead to the forehead, and they're not deterred. So the last thing I want to mention is that ritual is deeply involved in social group cognition. It develops very, very early in ontogeny. So even babies, infants, expect members of a group to behave in similar sorts of ways. We've done some experimental research demonstrating that just participating in a ritual increases in-group preference, that children imitate rituals as a way to affiliate with others, and that the threat of social exclusion increases the motivation to engage in ritual. So if my status within a group is threatened, I double down on imitating the practices of that group as a way to signal to others, no, really, please, I need to re-affiliate and be re-included. Because rituals are associated with that high fidelity imitation and are associated with very low levels of innovation, this creates very high fidelity transmission of group practices over very, very long periods of time. So the fact that rituals are socially stipulated and causally opaque makes them resistant to individual level innovation and preserves these practices over vast spaces and periods of time. So to wrap up, what are the implications for cultural transmission? For cultural groups to maintain cohesion over time, there have to be mechanisms for high fidelity transfer. Rituals provide that. Social learning is prepared by a set of cognitive biases that stabilize group-specific information, biases to conform, to attend to consensus and social norms. So rituals facilitate the high-fidelity transmission of group practices intergeneration, within and between groups. So they have a function. As I've mentioned, all fitness-relevant events have rituals associated with them in every human group ever studied: birth, childhood, marriage, warfare, death. This alone should put ritual at the core of understanding the evolution of human cognition and culture. Apologies, I haven't updated the American president picture because I can't bear to. So we're just going to go with that. So convergent developments across social scientific disciplines provide evidence that ritual is a psychologically prepared, culturally inherited behavioral trademark of our species. They are likely cultural adaptations to the problems of group living, and they're built on by reliably developing features of our psychology. They play a critical role in cultural transmission and in the ontogeny of social cognition. And from my perspective, a cognitive scientific take on ritual provides critical insight into the evolution and ontogeny of social group cognition. And if you're looking for a candidate for what makes humans special, I think you should look right here, right? Where young children are motivated to engage in the practices of others just to be like them. Not because they know why, but just because they want to be like others. And I will wrap up there. Thank my wonderful lab, my funders, my research participants, and to all of you for your attention.
Do you have to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed it. My question was, you spent the whole time talking about how ritual was adaptive and functional and all those kind of things.
Sure.
And in the chimpanzee example, my understanding of that was they were saying, we can't find any function for this, so it must be ritual. Why is there that switch in animal studies where as soon as they can find a function for it, then they don't want to call it ritual?
No, it's a great question. So I suppose it depends on what you mean by function. So rituals, in fact, as in human populations, have a ton of function. I think in the case of the chimpanzees, the assumption is not that there isn't a function at all. There could very well be a social function, that this practice could have an effect on the population in some particular way, but that the function isn't limited to a particular instrumental goal. That the function is more than just, I'm attempting to procure a mate, or I am displaying to another rival chimp, communicating my superior physical prowess or something of that sort. So I think the point of that work is to show that there's functionality there that's larger than a kind of concrete, specific, instrumental purpose. But the challenge of putting together a phylogenetic account of ritual is that rituals have they're incredibly complex social behavior. And they have a lot of superficial characteristics that look very much like the behavior you find in other animals, right? And keep in mind, spurious associations between cause and effect occur in all animals. So that's clearly isn't sufficient to constitute ritualistic practice. I mean, look like a school of fish can look ritualistic. And I don't think people would claim that there's a social function of that. There is a function, certainly, of schooling fish, but.
Thank you very much. You used the word contract early on, which always makes me slightly wary because that's the way we think in the West. I mean,
Sure.
We're materialists, even when we're talking about spiritual matters.
Yeah.
But in our long tradition, there's also the theme of covenant,
Yeah.
which is much more second personal.
Yes.
And although a kind of implicit contract to get goods is one way of thinking about ritual, the fact is it brings people together. It's an example of shared awareness, of shared focus. So we can bring in a language of joint attention, second person relationship, of covenant there. And regardless of what the goal is materially, union of persons comes
Absolutely.
back to that. Would you like to comment on that at all?
Oh, absolutely. So I think there are different categories of ritual. You have the categories of ritual, like the simpatias that I discussed, that are they're rituals with instrumental goals, and those are more contractual. Although in some cases it's not even clear who the contract is with. Most ritual, though, is purely collective action, the only function of which is cohesion, is community, is communion with others. So that's a big part of what rituals are for. So rituals really run the gamut to kind of more superstitious ritualistic remedies that are very instrumental, all the way kind of on the other side of the spectrum to large-scale collective practices, large or small scale, that are purely about social cohesion, togetherness. There is, in fact, no obvious instrumental goal whatsoever. And most of human behavior is some blend of the two. And by the way, as you point out, there's enormous cultural variation in what people assume is appropriate to have a ritualistic contract for. Even in things like prayer, one of the things I've been most astonished by in doing research in different Christian denominations is what differences in what different groups think it's appropriate to ask God for. Where in some populations asking God for advice about your haircut is appropriate. My personal experience, having raised Catholic, asking God about a haircut would be kind of trivial and kind of embarrassing to assume that God needed to be busy with something like that. So there's a lot of variation in what rituals, what their goals are, what they're for, and how people think about whether they're contractual or not. And even in the case where there is a clear contract or the perception of a contract, people aren't sure they'll always work, right? So there's not the assumption that, I know for sure this is going to happen.
You mentioned the high fidelity of ritual,
Yes.
where there's sort of very low innovation. It wouldn't be appropriate. People wouldn't trust your sympathias
if you announce that you created it.
Yes.
Yeah. No.
So how come people get new rituals? How do you have an account of that?
I am working on that. I mean, I think that's $1 million question. So a couple potential hypotheses. One is that rituals tend to be introduced by people who are higher in the hierarchy. So in the context of organized religion, there are experts, and there is a collective decision-making process by which new rituals are created. There is also some degree of, new information can be introduced through error, and very much like a kind of evolutionary biological process, kind of applied to a cultural system. That's one way. It's also the case that rituals can be intentionally created by groups in order to procure power. So if in evangelical Christianity is actually full of examples of particular charismatic leaders who decide that they want more power than they're currently being allocated and go off and join or found their own movement and group. And it turns out their ritual practices are different. From an outside perspective, boy, do they look similar to their community of origin. But there's that one or two critical difference that turns out to be all important. And not adhering to these new rituals is an absolute deal breaker. So there's multiple mechanisms for where new rituals come from. And new groups, I was talking about this earlier today, in fact, new groups require new rituals that are in critical ways distinct from the rituals of other groups.
Thanks so much for the really engaging talk. I have a question about opacity.
Yeah.
And I keep tripping up over the fact that needs to be included as a core element to defining ritual.
Sure. Yeah.
And connected to that, I'm curious about this idea of cause and effect either being opaque or maybe just not even there at all.
Sure.
Given what we know about, say, the placebo effect.
Yeah.
And how you can actually have a ritual like giving someone a pill of a certain color in a certain country.
Yeah.
As compared to even a different country.
Yeah.
And it will actually have a physiological effect on, say, their cortisol levels or whatever.
Mind is very powerful.
Right. So how does that integrate then into this big framework and understanding of ritual?
Well, I think the taking of pills is that's a biomedical ritual. And the idea that ingesting something, which has a kind of biological guise to it, I think the taking of pills is a great example of how most behavior we engage in is a fusion of ritual and instrumental acts. So let me give you another example. Cooking. We are given recipes, or we look them up online, or learn them from our grandparents, or whatever the case is. Most of the recipes that we use have certain procedural steps that have physical causal functions. So if you're making bread, there are some things you need to do, and if you do not do them, the bread does not turn out. So there's certain chemical processes that occur. So there is, these recipes are not fully opaque, right? Even if I don't know why adding yeast makes the bread rise, there is a physical causality associated with some of it. But there's also a lot of procedural steps associated with like baking bread or engaging in a recipe that are purely decorative. They're purely about making a particular food appear in a particular sort of way. So if you think about brioche or any sort of bread, there's a lot about that preparation that's about making something physically, but also about bringing something or creating something that's associated with the identity of a particular group. So there are elements of almost all of our behavior that are purely about, like, this is food that's associated with this particular group, and it should always look this way. Well, there's some kind of elements that are physical and causal. So most are a blend. But in most cases, even if there is a mechanism we don't know it, and we don't need to know it. It's the beauty of a recipe. I cannot really be an expert cook or baker at all, but if I follow these procedures with high levels of fidelity, the recipe will usually work out, except when there's a whole bunch of unspecified details the recipe doesn't include and it doesn't turn out at all. But you get the point.
So you talked about details and rituals earlier.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I was thinking that there's probably like a limit to how many details you could have to where it'd be kind of too kind of taxing.
Sure, good point.
And then there's other rituals that like fewer details would be better because then people can pick up on them real easy. So I'm wondering what kinds of rituals lend towards detail and what kinds of rituals lend towards the other way.
It's a great point. So with these Simpatias, we found that most of them have max 6 or 7 procedural steps to them. Probably not an accident. And if you ask people why a particular, which we did, so we noticed that you spend a lot of time and effort doing the Simpatia. We also can not help but notice that you still don't have a job. So this particular Simpatia oriented towards getting a job appears not to have worked. How do you explain that? A couple of ways. One is, this specified that I was supposed to use this particular type of mango, but I was feeling a bit short on time, so I didn't get that particular mango. Critical mistake. Or, I was kind of feeling a bit skeptical about whether this would work, and my lack of faith is clearly responsible for this. So as I say, these are impossible to disprove. I mean, they're really very tremendously difficult. And when people don't engage in ritualistic practices with very high levels of fidelity, even children, you ask them why. Their typical response is, I wanted to do all the steps, but I just couldn't remember. Do you do this before that or that before the other? So they will comment on intent for complete fidelity, but also acknowledging that the memory is fallible. So would I expect that there are Simpatias with 55 steps? No. No, probably not. Again, these are products of the human mind. So they always interact with kind of the psychological processing demands, which is really an excellent point.
You mentioned taboos, right?
Yeah.
I wonder to what extent or when do taboos become rituals or can be regarded as rituals?
So that's a great question. I think that taboos are, I suppose I feel comfortable saying that they are rituals and that they're typically opaque. So for example, I work in Vanuatu, which is a Melanesian archipelago, and there are a lot of taboos associated with, and restrictions, they're basically behavioral restrictions, right? There's many of these associated with when you can and cannot fish. And it turns out that a lot of the prohibitions against fishing are associated with when fish are spawning. So you don't want to be fishing when catching fish when they are spawning, right? You catch fish before they release their eggs, there will be fewer fish in the future. But you ask people about these fishing taboos, they don't give functionalist explanations like my bias. They give supernatural explanations, and they comment quite extensively on risks for lack of compliance. The gods will be angry, all kinds of negative repercussions will ensue. And in many ways, you need those kinds of negative consequences because people like fish. It's a sacrifice not to fish. It's a primary protein source on islands, as you can imagine. So people are incurring a cost by not fishing. Thus, you really need to increase the potential risk and danger of violating that particular taboo. Yeah.
Thank you. My question was in regards to, at some point I felt a little lack of distinction between the rituals that would be directed more to establish a relationship with like supernatural or God.
Sure.
In regards to the rituals that are more like a recipe of bread.
Yeah.
And they look quite different, and they had been studied in the past in a very different way. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, why would you group them all in the same category
Great
when they have
question.
very different intentions?
Yeah, that's a tremendously good question. And the reason for that is I think it's very useful, and from a cognitive psychological perspective, to see how far you can get by looking at structural similarities. So that's one of the reasons why I specify that rituals are causally opaque and socially stipulated, because that allows me to look at common features among what are superficially very, very different sorts of behaviors. So I can see that if you, on the surface, this chati ceremony that I described, this initiation ritual that occurs 6 days after birth in northern India, on the surface, that's quite different than and that is about promoting good luck. That's about initiating a baby into a community. That's a very different sort of thing than a simpatia associated with getting a partner in Brazil. But if you look at the content, the fact that they're repetitious, there's a lot of procedural detail, there's tremendous scientific value at looking at the shared psychology that supports behaviors which on a superficial level are quite distinct. So the goal here is to look at what about our cognitive system supports the participation in these very, very diverse practices. So it's not the case that I think all of these rituals are the same and have the same functions. Rituals have enormous symbolic meaning. There's lots of different things that rituals do. I think there's scientific value at looking at how much diving down a little bit can identify underlying psychological frameworks for this behavior.
I've been enjoying the idea that we're really talking about celebrating individual differences or individual group differences. And I think it's quite refreshing. But the question is, when we're trying to talk about uniformity, when we're talking about inclusivity, how do we ever make sense of that when we realize that, you know, that the beauty of a diamond is its multifacetedness, and it's the same with creation. Yeah.
Rituals, I think rituals are extraordinary because although they are universal and they're prepared by a set of psychological mechanisms that all humans share, they are among the most kind of diverse features of human culture. So rituals, I think, are special because they're kind of universal features of human culture, but they also accommodate enormous cultural diversity. So yeah, all cultures have rituals associated with birth, but those birth rituals are enormously diverse. And those practices vary within and between groups. So they give populations and individuals opportunities to express differences as well as to be members of social groups. And so one example that I came across recently, I had the great privilege to go to Japan for the first time. And one of the things that I noticed is that, well, in all human populations, we demarcate private spaces from public spaces, and footwear helps make that distinction. So it's fairly common in many populations to take your shoes off before entering the home. The Japanese have taken this to a whole different level. And at the inn that I was staying in, I found that shoe changes were required, I think, for at least 4 different times. So when you enter the kind of the entryway of a home, you take your shoes off and you put slippers on. When you enter more interior spaces of the home, there are different slippers for that. There's, in fact, 3rd pair of slippers for your own space, your room, and there are special bathroom slippers. And I was very eager. By the way, no one explained any of these shoe requirements to me, but I learned very quickly by observing and imitating others, right? A human like everyone else. So I had learned all these shoe changes, and interestingly, I didn't bring any of my own slippers. And it turns out I have much larger feet than most Japanese women and men, in fact. And so I wore these house slippers that were not a great fit for my foot, but I still wore them, and no one judged me for it. And even more interesting, I changed into the bedroom slippers and the bathroom slippers with no observer. There was no one there to see that I didn't wear these slippers, these incredibly ill-fitting slippers. And yet I did it anyway, right? So rituals allow you to be members, to participate in another population's behaviors. This is very, very powerful, right? So I wasn't under the assumption that I was a, instant member, cultural expert, just because I sort of figured out the rules for shoe change, but it made me feel more included. And I felt very motivated to do that despite a complete lack of instruction. And yet we still figure it out. And often we figure it out by knowing that we're not doing it right. A lot of information to be gained that way.
If you're trying to influence a sort of behavioural change in society, has this method of inventing new rituals been used much by policy makers and people seeking to influence that change? For example, the liquid gold. So if we say it's liquid gold, and give your child engage in that, give your child liquid gold, that might cut through, people who might be, if you put a sort of logical argument why they should have colostrum, they might not trust that, they might be suspicious of a rational argument. But if you actually invent, some kind of ritual, then people are more likely to go along with that than if they were given a rational argument as to why they should change their behavior.
Well, that's certainly one of the things that we're exploring in using ritual to inform global public health interventions. I don't think it's the case that people aren't receptive to rational arguments for behavior. I think they just they aren't critical, or I would say they aren't required in all cases, that we are very willing in many cases, I think for good reason, to defer to experts, which is why the vast majority of women in Western biomedical environments comply with all of the ritualistic practices and checkups associated with pregnancy and birth without being able to explain exactly why this scan needs to be done at this point. Why do I have to take these folic acid tablets, and what in the world is inside of them? And those are enormous tablets, by the way. That's extraordinary that you get people to agree to take a tablet. That's like, anyway, I've seen them recently because we're working on interventions associated with them. So appealing to expertise, to normativity. And if other people in your community are engaging in a behavior, on average, it's probably a good idea. Can it lead to mistakes and errors? For example, this widespread fear of vaccines is a great example of how the introduction of new social norms can be very damaging. I mean, measles is back as a major problem in the developed world, where it was nearly eradicated, right? So social norms can lead you astray, but they can lead you on the path to better outcomes. And we're very attentive to that information. So that's the idea that attending to the ritual practices of a population is a good place to look for behavioral change.
Before you mentioned memory for remembering all the steps of a ritual, and also when you were remembering past events about your involvement in rituals, you said that you had to control yourself because you didn't want to do something, but you had to do it. So my question is, what is the role of all these components, so executive functions in rituals?
Yeah, so imitative fidelity, the ability to reproduce a behavior you observe, requires a lot of cognitive processes. So it requires your ability to inhibit behavior, to attend, working memory. All of these sorts of behaviors, all of these cognitive processes develop very rapidly over the course of early childhood. We find parallel increases in imitative fidelity. So 3-year-olds imitate behavior with lower fidelity than 6-year-olds, even when they intend to behave in exactly the same way. 3-year-olds' brains aren't as developed as a 6-year-old's brain. So there are some constraints, cognitive constraints in imitative fidelity for ritual and for other sorts of human behaviors. So this kind of affects the development of behavior over time. But the intent for high fidelity is still there. And there's actually a really fascinating and rapidly growing literature looking at the kind of cognitive architecture that supports social learning and imitative fidelity more broadly. Executive functioning is a big part of that.
I think we've probably reached an actual conclusion.
All right.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much.